Hillary Clinton lashes out at her country's news networks for failing to inform domestic audiences about world events. Well, is the US really losing the information war? And is public funding the solution? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Sami Zeidan. Well, America is facing an information war, and we are losing that war. That's what US Secretary of State Hillary Clinton had to say as she spoke before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. A war, she says, is being won by networks that offer what she described as real news.
You've got a set of global networks that Al Jazeera has been the leader in, that are literally changing people's minds and attitudes. And like it or hate it, it is really effective. And in fact, viewership of Al Jazeera is going up in the United States because it's real news. You may not agree with it, but you feel like you're getting real news around the clock instead of a million commercials. We have a great cultural export, but we're not competing in the way we need to compete in the information values arena. Al Jazeera is. The Chinese have opened up a global English network and a network in other languages. Russia has opened up a global English network. We are missing in action.
Well, as you can imagine, those comments were not shared by everyone. Right-wing commentator Glenn Beck was quick to respond. He said Al Jazeera was the propaganda arm of the Middle East and Islamic extremism. He went on to say, you have the Secretary of State of the United States of America saying you cannot get real news here in America. You can only get it from Al Jazeera. Everybody knows it. Well, this is insanity. Well, for more on this, I'm joined by our three guests now in London. Tom Fenton, former foreign correspondent for CBS and author of Bad News, The Decline of Reporting, The Business of News and the Danger to Us All. Charlie Wolf, a political commentator and broadcaster, and joining us on broadband from Cairo, Abdullah Schleifer. He's a former NBC Cairo bureau chief and now Professor Emeritus of Journalism at the American University of Cairo. Thank you all for joining us. If I could start with Tom, first of all, is there a media war going on?
Well, if there's a media war going on, the American networks are absent from the combat to a large extent. Most of the mainstream American broadcasters, as well as the mainstream printed press, really went out of the foreign or international news gathering business a long time ago.
Why did you say if there, Tom? Why did you start with if?
Sorry, what do you mean?
Are you not convinced that there is a media war going on?
Well, I'm not sure what war you're talking about. If you're talking about the information war, yes, no question about that. I was thinking about our own domestic market in the United States, which is so poorly served.
Well, I mean the one that Secretary of State Hillary Clinton seems to be talking about there in competition with the channels she's mentioned, including Al Jazeera.
She's right. I mean, if you compare the impact of Al Jazeera or the impact of Al Hurra, the American government-sponsored Arabic news channel, which very few people watch in the Middle East, although, incidentally, after the beginning of these uprisings in the Middle East, it has suddenly increased its viewership. But Al Jazeera is far and away the most important, the one that has had the greatest influence, and the one that has really changed, I think, the degree of political sophistication of the Arab population of the Middle East. It has been partly responsible for what is happening now, simply because it is presenting not government television, not propaganda. It tries to show both sides or three sides of a question, and as a result has made the population of Tunisia, of Egypt, and the other countries in the Middle East more aware of what's going on in the rest of the Arab world, and less likely to believe the propaganda they get from their government television.
All right, Professor Abdullah Schleifer.
We don't have anything to come.
We could shift gears a little bit. Professor Abdullah Shleifer, you've worked, so to speak, on both sides of the divide for American networks, for Arab networks. Why is the U.S. narrative losing the war here?
Well, first of all, Sammy, let me start by saying I never thought of myself, whether I was working for NBC or Al Arabiya or as a regular contributor to Jazeera English, I never thought of myself as a foot soldier in anybody's information war. I'm a journalist. And as a journalist, I would say that the quality of American network of television journalism has deteriorated, especially if we're talking about international coverage, foreign coverage. It's deteriorated terribly over the past couple decades. And there are a number of reasons for it. One of them is that it became a profit center. You know, when network news started, it was originally considered a public service. It wasn't a profit center. That was for entertainment. But it became a profit center, which made it very nice for us back in the 70s because we could hire Lear jets all the time. But the problem is that the viewership of American network television has declined radically over the last couple of decades because of competition from cable, from many other sources, of course, the internet. Now, when your profits decline, you have the only way you can maintain a profit is either to maintain your audience, which they didn't, the audiences have declined, or you cut your costs. So the first decision was to cut foreign coverage. So whereas
hang on, Professor Abdullah, is the assumption, is what you're saying here, that somehow they reached the conclusion that you cannot make any money in the US by covering international news?
Well, what it is that international news is costly, and there's greater interest in, unless there's some extraordinary, some extraordinary incident going on, a sort of full column headline in a newspaper, that type of incident, like the uprising in Egypt or like the tsunami, that generally people are more interested in national news and even local news. So therefore, if the networks have to cut their costs, which is the only way they can sustain their profits, by cutting their costs, they're going to cut their costs by closing down their foreign bureaus, and that's what happened.
Okay.
Back in the 70s, all the networks maintained bureaus here in Cairo, especially from the mid-70s on. And those bureaus are gone.
Right.
CNN is the only one that maintains a full bureau.
Okay, let's bring in, if we could, Charlie Wolf into this discussion. I think Secretary of State Hillary Clinton mentioned things like too many commercials, too many talking heads, opinion, and we've got what Professor Abdullah Shleifer said, not enough bureaus. Is it the responsibility, or should we blame the media for any loss in American narrative in the world or international war over media?
No, actually, I don't think we should. And this is where I was a bit struck by her comments. They seemed a bit disconnected and confused. I can't disagree really to a great extent with my two colleagues. American news is not as foreign-based as it used to be. American news reporting has probably declined in many respects from, those of us from the old school would probably say. But she was sitting in front of this Senate hearing, Foreign Relations Committee hearing, about budgets for the government. It's the government's job to make their case in the great war of ideas. It's not up to NBC, CBS, or ABC to do that. They're commercial enterprises to serve their audiences in a free and open market. And again, we can debate whether they're doing it correctly or incorrectly, and it's their shareholders who'll either win or lose as to how this is doing. But to sit there and talk about Al Jazeera or the BBC on the world stage and then complain because CBS has commercials or NBC, or funny enough, she was talking about the irony of, she was going on about them having nothing but talking heads, and here we are, 3 talking heads on Al Jazeera, so a bit of irony there. So
is there
I'm not quite sure what she
problem
was
perhaps
getting
with the commercial model, or the way that the commercial model has evolved in the US, Charlie?
Not fully. I agree with, again, what Abdullah was saying about how they're running their business models, and yes, they're now cutting costs to some extent, and it may not have the same public service notion that it may have had back in, say, the 70s or 80s. But that said, we have a free and open press. They are commercial concerns, and people have the right to run their businesses as they see fit. And obviously, their audiences must be attracted to this, or if the audiences really wanted more international news, they'd be doing it. I think to some extent there's a slight cultural difference between those of us living in London where, you know, obviously I watch the BBC and get a lot of foreign news, and I watch Al Jazeera from time to time and Press TV, and the United States, where they're more domesticated models, and people want to know, as I remember from my early radio days, everything is local.
All right, if we could go back to Tom once again, but is the drive for opinion also to blame for what's happened within the US network system?
Well, it's part of the problem. To have an opinion, you need facts, and of course the problem with American coverage nowadays, and particularly of foreign affairs, there is so little. It is so thin. There's so few facts. So a small amount of factual information is being chewed over again and again by the opinionators of the right and the left. And to go back to what Charlie Wolf said, he's right that Secretary Clinton had somewhat confused the issues, but she was comparing American domestic networks and the coverage that they give the American public and what is known as public diplomacy, the government's own efforts through the Voice of America, Al Hurrah, or whatever, to present an American point of view to the rest of the world. The basic problem that is facing American broadcast television is that it used to be considered a lost leader. It was your ticket to get a piece of the electromagnetic spectrum of the airwaves, your frequency. In return, you had to perform a public service, and American networks performed a pretty darn good public service. They had CBS, for example, the network that I worked for many years, had so many foreign correspondents. At one point, they had a full-time foreign correspondent in West Beirut and another full-time foreign correspondent in East Beirut. That was two.
Gosh, those were the days, I guess, Tom Fenton. But we're hearing a lot from our guests about confusing the issue here. What is the issue that the U.S. Secretary of State is concerned about? Is she worried about other foreign channels becoming the source of information for Americans when it comes to overseas developments? Or is she worried about other foreign channels beating Americans or American networks in presenting a narrative to the whole world?
Well, frankly, I think she really did confuse the issue. She's really worried about her budget. That's why she was talking to Congress. She doesn't want the State Department and its public diplomacy arms to be slashed any more than is necessary. That was the problem. She hit the nail on the head when she talked about the problems of the American networks, but that's not the issue. The real issue for her, of course, was America's voice overseas, and that's not what NBC does or CBS or ABC.
Right.
We do have, however, CNN International, which does a pretty darn good job covering the world and is available overseas rather widely.
Right, let's go to Abdullah Schleifer, we could, in Cairo. When Secretary Clinton said that the U.S. private media can't really fill the gap, was she hinting at the need for perhaps some public funding, a publicly funded television station? How did you read that?
Well, you know, right now we've been considering two models. Hillary Clinton's concern, which is for, you know, government stations, I mean, like VOA, El Hora, directly government finance, or the private American. And of course, they're not comparative. But on the other hand, we do have this problem of poor coverage. Now, even CNN International, I would say, was a lot better a number of years ago than it is today. I watch it. It's one of 3 channels I watch all the time in English. And even they have come under commercial pressure. I don't know why. I could understand domestically between CNN and Fox, but even they have sort of turned the news into a sort of quasi-entertainment vehicle, where instead of simply having news bulletins all the time, they have shows all the time. Now,
so you feel that maybe public funding is an alternative, Professor Abdullah?
Yes, what I'm suggesting is there's a third option, and that third option is public service television, which is publicly funded but not government run.
All right, let's take that point. Sorry if I could jump in. Let's bring in Charlie Wolf once again. Do you agree with that?
No, unfortunately, I don't. And the reason being is you look at the BBC, and it does, on the whole, a fine job. I don't have a major complaint. But that said, my license fee is funding something that I may not believe in, especially on a domestic level. I think it's pretty well written that the BBC has a cultural, there's a cultural bubble it lives in, which is very much to the left. So I don't think it serves a purpose. And that was my worry. I was wondering why it was any business of the Secretary of State of the United States to worry about commercial broadcasters. If anybody should be concerned, it should be the shareholders of NBC, ABC, CBS, Fox, etc.
Well, I guess she's worried about U.S. influence around the world.
But that's her job. that's what the Secretary of State does, not NBC, CBS at all. And it's interesting to note, here in the United Kingdom, for instance, we have the BBC domestic service, which is funded by the license fee, the BBC World Service, which is very much lauded and is separate, is actually funded by the our version of the State Department, the Foreign Office, but its budget is being cut. So we're under the same problems here. I'm trying to think what role she's thinking of. We have VOA, so let's go with VOA. NPR is not an international service. I don't really think it should be, and I don't see totally a need for funding. This is one of the debates that's going on right now. I think what she's alluding to tangentially is NPR, PBS is in a lot of hot water recently over the Juan Williams affair. He was one of their commentators, one of their analysts who also appears on Fox News, had made a comment and got fired for this. Meanwhile, there are other commentators or other analysts that make far crazier comments that stay on. The Republicans want to defund NPR, and part of their argument is they don't need the money. The funding only represents about 2-3% of their budget. They make more money from selling Elmo and Big Bird and Sesame Street toys. So I wonder if she's trying to sort of push a bit of an agenda here.
Now, some believe there's more to winning any information war than public funding and investing in those foreign resources. Alexander Cockburn wrote in Counterpunch magazine, what would the state-subsidized propagandists be able to boast about? Predator raids in Afghanistan, Guantanamo, 30 million on part-time work or jobless in the homeland? America is not the cell it once was when the economic growth rate was headed up and capitalism seemed capable of delivering on its promises. Let's go to Tom Fenton. Would you agree with that analysis, Tom?
I would say that the whole idea of public diplomacy to start with, I think, is very misguided. Facts speak for themselves. Actions speak louder than words. The biggest problem with America's public diplomacy programs is that it's not that they don't know how to deliver the message or they don't know how to package the message. It's the policies themselves, the double standards that America uses quite frequently in dealing with the rest of the world. Of course, we're seeing the problem right now when Arab leaders, long time entrenched, non-democratic regimes that we've been doing business with for years are suddenly being toppled, and we're faced with an embarrassing situation that the people that we're now saying we're undemocratic dictators, yesterday they were our strong allies. It's a problem of public action. It's a problem of American policy. It's not a problem of public diplomacy. It's not a problem of selling it correctly, and that's a great that's the great dilemma in Washington. And I think it's too often seen in terms of advertising rather than in terms of policy.
All right, let's go back to Abdullah Schleifer if we could. Professor, so far you seem to be the only person who is convinced that some form of public funding might help here. I think what some of the other guests are saying is that if the goods aren't good enough, public funds for the marketing campaign ain't going to work.
Well, BBC, as I said, is still offering I believe, a far better product. I mean, it's true they're having budget cuts, but maybe they could handle them better if they cut down the exorbitant salaries they pay their top executives. But in terms of people in the field, news coverage, Jazeera is another example of public service broadcasting. It is not a privately not a privately owned commercial channel. It is sort of modeled after BBC. The funding comes from official bodies, but it operates with autonomy, which is BBC at its best, Jazeera at its best. I think it's viable. I think it could happen in America, because I do think you can't simply say, well, that's the American enterprise system. The enterprise system, when applied to broadcast journalism, has been catastrophic. And it has led, for bottom line reasons, to simply dissolving serious foreign coverage. It has led to the sort of packaging. We don't have foreign correspondents anymore for bottom line reasons, because a bureau in Washington can pump out more stories. Everything becomes cost analysis. Well, that's not journalism. And I think that, therefore, there has to be another alternative, and it could be precisely, I would disagree with my colleague Tom, by expanding PBS and NPR. Now, I mean, there will always be sniping, you know, at something. So obviously, PBS, I think BBC was so successful that they developed a bit of an arrogance. So maybe they're simply not ready to be cognizant of the fact that they have to be more conscious about not showing their internal political biases, because that's what it's all about. We all carry political baggage with us, but it should not determine what news gets on. That should be all right.
Isn't it true, looking at what has happened in the Middle East and looking at how people have heralded Al Jazeera's coverage of it, that there still is a place for what you might call, or what Secretary Clinton called, the old media? What do you think, Abdullah Schleifer?
I think there is a place. And even if there's a two-tier system developing, as Tom mentioned, we have a moral obligation as broadcasters or print journalists to provide the best. And I think it's tragic that people now have to settle, and this is even creeping in to Al Jazeera, but nothing like American television. The basic information always came from field reports, where the journalist, the reporter would go out in the field. He had time to shoot a story, to compose a script. And although it certainly would not have the depth of, let's say, a print magazine, it does mean the great audience would see a television report that had drama, but at the same time had 2 or 3 minutes of information. Instead of today.
All right. Charlie, do you agree with that?
Well, I think Al Jazeera is a unique model, and obviously it's gaining relevance because it has an area of expertise. I'm not going to know the Middle East as well as someone that comes from the Middle East. So right now, when you have Egypt, Tunisia, Libya, etc. going on, then yes, it's the natural to turn to, whereas I don't see Al Jazeera is going to be popping up in the ratings when it comes to the arguments going on over funding in Wisconsin or the next American presidential election, or the primaries that will be coming up in the next 6 months. But, you know, we are living in a smaller world now, and broadcasting is not what it was in the 70s. You didn't need, you know, guys developing film, etc. You can set up Press TV, for instance. The Iranian station, you don't need the budget nowadays to set up these organizations, or CCTV, or the Russians, etc. They may not be as good as Al Jazeera, but it can be done. So the model is changing, and people will have, broadcasters will have to cope with that.
And the final question from Tom Fenton. Are broadcasters in the US really coping with it? Are they changing with the times?
No, indeed, they're not. You know, for a while after 9/11, I thought maybe they would. All of a sudden, the budgets were torn up. People were sent out to the field. I remember going to Pakistan and Afghanistan and going to Germany, visiting the mosques there. But they simply they ran out of interest, or ran out of money, or didn't have enough people to keep it up. It is so thin now. Each of the 3 big American terrestrial broadcasters have just a handful of full-time correspondents to cover the world. They don't have the troops anymore. And there's no interest there that I can see in reopening all the foreign bureaus that have been closed. You know, they closed down Moscow, they closed down even Tel Aviv, which was sort of unclosable and untouchable for a long time. I see no idea at all, no interest in changing that. and yet somehow it must change if the public is going to be informed.
All right, we'll leave it there now. We'll have to thank our guests at this point. Tom Fenton from London, Abdullah Schleifer from Cairo, and Charlie Wolf, also from the British capital. Thank you all for joining us here. Thank you, the viewer, for joining us here on this edition of Inside Story. As always, we welcome your comments and suggestions. Email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. For now, it's goodbye.